strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die. Whoso looks on the face of the generation this day, in respect of religion, may behold a lamentable decay in spirituals therein. Great things has God done for us again and again, not only of old but of late. But alas, amidst all our repeated deliverances, we are like to pine away under spiritual plagues. Oh, that on such solemn occasions we were stirred up to strengthen the things which remain, that are ready to die. This is a direction given to the church of Sardis, which had a name to live, and yet was dead. A church which had as much as made those about her to reckon her in a good condition. But God knew, and themselves might know. They were far from it. Death had got up into their windows and was making havoc of the spiritual case of all sorts. The directions for a recovery in this verse are two. Number 1, be watchful. Carelessness had ruined all with them. They are called to bestir themselves to habitual watchfulness. Secondly, strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die. Revelation 3 verse 2. In which you may notice two things. Number 1, the decaying and declining condition of this church, the things which remain that were ready to die, in which two things are to be observed. Number 1, religion among them was brought to a very low ebb. They had some remains of it with them, but it was but remains. Their former stock was much spent. The holy fire was become very weak. There is no necessity of restraining this to the really godly among them. It is spoken to the body of that church. Time was when there was another face upon them. Some had some lifelike stirrings by common operations of the Spirit, some by saving ones. But alas, both sorts had quenched the Spirit, and were not now what sometimes they had been. Number 2, that which was among them was like to die out. They were every day growing worse and worse. Their light was growing dimmer and dimmer. Their lamp was like to go out. Secondly, a seasonable duty pressed on them for their recovering. Strengthen the things which remain, and so on. Hold hand to what is left, that it do not go also. Underprop the tottering building, that it fall not down for altogether. Repair the breaches that are made in it. Add new fuel to the dying spark, that it may not be extinguished, but nourished and cherished, till it break out into a flame again. Doctrine. When religion with a person or people is brought to dying remains, it is high time for them to bestir themselves and strengthen these remains in order to a recovery. In handling this doctrine I shall show, number 1, when one's religion is decayed to dying remains, and number 2, what are the causes that bring one's religion to dying remains. Number 3, wherein lies the strengthening of things that remain and are ready to die. And 4th, apply this. First, when one's religion is decayed to dying remains, this is a weighty point, and in speaking to it I shall show, number 1, some things from whence one's religion may seem to be brought to dying remains, while really it is not so. And number 2, some things that will evidence one's religion to be brought to dying remains, whether they think it is so or not. First, I shall show some things from whence one's religion may seem to be brought to dying remains, while really it is not so. The wearing away of violent affections and commotions of heart in religion, or the settling of flashes of affection. It is true, some never had more of religion. In that case, indeed, when these are gone, all is gone, Matthew 13, verses 5 and 6. But even the true convert may have some glistering affections that are true ones when religion is new to him, and when these settle, and he gets more solidity of religion, that is not dying remains. James and John could have fired whole towns for Christ, Luke 9 verse 54. But when they had more of the Spirit, they were not so fiery. See that prayer of the apostles in Philippians 1 verse 9. And this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment. Some think, oh, the love they had to Christ. Sometimes they could not have prayed with dry cheeks and so on. But how like ye Christ now? Would you not rather part with all than with him? Are you tender of grieving a spirit? Do you pray oppressed with a sense of your sinfulness and unworthiness? These are not dying remains, as you may learn from what the apostle says in Romans 8:26. Likewise, the Spirit helps our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought. But the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. In 1 John 5:3, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. Number 2, one's not being able to go through with duties with that ease that sometimes they have done before. Hezekiah says in Isaiah 38 verse 15, I shall go softly all my years in the bitterness of my soul. Self-confidence mixing itself with grace may give more ease in the performance of duties than is welcome, the which when it is broken, so much of that ease is removed. One may have more temptations than formerly. The wind blowing harder in his face. Traveling is not so easy, but the horse may retain his mettle, though he go not so cleverly, carrying double as when single. But he who in the course of his way is striving, wrestling, and pressing forward to perfection, whether with less or more ease than formerly, is not come down to dying remains. Number 3, the marks of the decay of natural vigor left on religious duties. Christ says for his disciples, Matthew 26:41, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Though the being of religion does not depend on the case of the body, that there is such a close union between the soul and the body that the body may sometimes be a clog to the soul in religious duties, which is yet going forward in the way of God, not backward. It is not dying remains with old professors who in the way of believing in holy tenderness are pressing towards a mark, that sometimes they could have remembered much of sermons, continued long in prayers and holy exercises, heard or prayed not with dry cheeks, but now it is not so. Why? Natural vigor is gone, moisture is dried up, memory has failed, and so on. Was David's courage gone when Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, having succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him, his men swore to him, saying, You shall go no more out with us to battle, that you quench not the light of Israel, 2 Samuel 21 verse 17. The man may have his great love to God, hatred of sin, desire to remember the word as much as ever, and the impressions abide, though the expressions slip from him as much as ever, but he cannot make so good music as he did. Not because the skill has failed, but the instrument is cracked. Lastly, more felt stirring of corruption than before. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 7 verse 21, I find a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. In Romans 7 verse 24 he cries, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? This does not speak him under a decay, because the struggle was kept up. Corruption may stir more than it did, when it has less strength than before. As when death strikes to the heart of the patient, there are greater fightings than formerly. Not because he has more strength, but that then what he has is put forth to the utmost. Secondly, I shall show some things that will evidence one's religion to be brought to dying remains, whether they think it or not. Number 1, when the conscience boggles not, but at gross outbreakings, that speaks very little tenderness left with a man, that conscience has little of God's bonds on it. It has so little feeling that it is very near to being past feeling, Jude 23. It is not so with thriving Christians. Psalms 119 verse 113, the psalmist says, I hate vain thoughts, but thy law do I love. The conscience is the first thing that is awakened and becomes lively when the Lord is at work with the soul, and when it becomes untender, it is an evidence little is left. The untender conscience is an unfaithful watch in the soul, which may quickly involve it in ruin. It easily lets pieces of one's religion go one after another. It easily admits into one's practice things that have not the king's stamp on them one after another. And thus churches and particular professors hasten to ruin, the spiritual building being taken down piecemeal by growing untenderness. Proverbs 25 verse 28. He that has no rule over his own spirit, says Solomon, is like a city that is broken down and without walls. Number 2. When one's conscience is active in the circumstantials of religion, but lax and wide in the substantials of it, as in the case of the scribes and Pharisees, Matthew 23 verses 23 and 24, where Christ says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith, and so on. These are come to dying remains, for alas, the main channel, in which tenderness ought to run, is dry, or shamefully shallow. Where lies the main of religion? In holiness of heart and life? That is, in moral duty to God and our neighbor, according to the 10 Commandments? All the ordinances of church communion and society are but means to that end, and therefore they shall be laid by when this is fully attained, and they avail nothing when they do not advance holiness. Therefore we ought to be tender of both, Matthew 23 verse 23. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. And whether one make bold with the one or the other, his religion is like the legs of the lame, not equal, and what he has of it is but dying remains. Number 3. When there is but any one thing lacking to the perfection of one's religion in parts, that religion is in a ruinous condition that is not entire, James 1 verse 4. Like the house that stands lacking the copestone, the parts of religion are so necessarily to be joined together, that if one part be lacking, the rest cannot but moulder away. Mark 10 verse 21. So the whole of what the man has is but dying remains in regard of what is lacking. And hence it comes to pass, as one may bleed to death at a neglected wound while all the rest are taken care of, so one allowed lust will eat out the life of the soul, whatever execution seem to be made on the rest. Therefore, when a Christian's strength against sin and temptation is abated, that is a plain indication of a decay, for the path of the just is as a shining light that shines more and more to the perfect day. Proverbs 4 verse 18. This is a sad case for one, the longer he lives, to grow the weaker, to be the easier ensnared by a subtle devil and deceitful world. That says the communication between Christ and the soul is stopped up. If there be any at all, that corruptions wax stronger as the nails grow in decaying folk. Maybe you think you can pray as well as ever you did, but indeed you are not so patient, so humble, so denied to the world, and self-denied. You are easier led aside to sin than you are come to dying remains. Number 5. When the work of mortification is at a stand, the man's not watching his heart and noticing the lusts arising there and setting himself to mortify them, Romans 8 verse 13. A Christian, if he be not going forward, is going backward. If not adding to his stock, he is losing it. The garden will quickly be overgrown with weeds. If one be not daily working at them to pluck them up, the leaking ship is drawing water. If one be not busy at the pump, it may quickly be swallowed up. The thriving Christian never lacks work. Hence, says the apostle in Philippians 3, verses 13 and 14, Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth to those things which are before. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Number 6. When though the duties of religion be kept up, the spirit in their duties is gone, then what is left is but dying remains. For says our Lord in John 4, verse 24, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And the apostle says in Philippians 3, verse 3, we are the circumcision which worship God in the spirit. The sense of God's command does not stir up the man to duty. Love to the Lord does not draw him to it. God's honor is not in his eye. He goes out in his duty in the power of his gifts, but no panting for the blowings of the Spirit. The spirit of the man goes not along with his body. His bodily worship, actions, and gestures are but naked, yea, false signs. He closes his eyes, but his heart is not fixed on God. Bows his knees, but his heart is not humbled. He aims not at the enjoyment of God, but all his duties run into the Dead Sea of self. Lastly, when one has become a stranger to the life of faith in Christ Jesus, what is left is but dying remains. The soul, if it have any life in that case, is in a swoon. For the life which we now live in the flesh, we live by the faith of the Son of God. Galatians 2:20. The thriving soul is employing him daily as a prophet, a priest, a king, growing into him, coming out of itself more and more, believing his word, prizing his imputed righteousness as its only hope, and laboring to subject the whole soul to him and his commands, and the disposals of his providence. Where this is lacking, and the soul never grows more self-denied, more humble, resigning the will to the Lord, what is there but dying remains? Part 2. I shall show what are the causes that brings one's religion to dying remains. Number 1, unwatchfulness, Revelation 3, verse 2. Carelessness about one's body is oftentimes fatal to it. About one's substance breeds a consumption in their estate, and unwatchfulness over the heart breeds a spiritual decay. How many this day have little or nothing left them in religion, who were once in a fair way of thriving had they but watched their hearts? Alas, there are too many enemies waiting to ensnare the soul from without and within, for any to think they will get their attainments kept if they do not watch. Secondly, spiritual sloth, Ecclesiastes 10 verse 18. This is a bewitching sin, and if one Satan get men asleep on this enchanted ground, be sure they shall be robbed and spoiled there. Thus a spouse will rather let Christ go than set her foot on the cold and wet ground. Song of Solomon 5 verse 3. Everyone has a devil's agent within him, buzzing in his ear, Master, spare yourself. And when men sleep, the tares are sown. Number 3, quenching of the Spirit, 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 19. When the Spirit goes as he goes, so liveliness goes. Some cast water on this holy fire by sinning against light, which wastes the conscience, defiles the soul, fills it with darkness and deadness. Some ruin themselves by their not nourishing and cherishing this fire to give fuel to it, but they bring themselves into darkness and deadness by neglecting it. Some smother it by taking part with someone lust or other against it, and so resist and rebel against the Spirit, to their own shipwreck. Application. I shall drop a word to two sorts of persons first. To those with whom nothing remains but all is died out. Time was you had convictions and awakenings at a sermon, on a sick bed or otherwise. But now of all that ever they got at, all the communions, sermons, afflictions, and so on. Nothing remains, but they are just where they were before that time, if not worse. To stir you up to see to yourselves in time, I would pose your consciences with the following queries. When you had your awakenings, would you not have given all the world to have had that undone that you had done? Why then turn back to the same courses? Number 2, did you not resolve never to be so unconcerned about your soul as you have been? What have you done with these resolutions? Were you fools to make them, or were you fools to break them? Number 3, did you think God's wrath against sin a mere scarecrow then? Why look you on it so now? Could you sleep sound this night if God should send you home with his arrows again in your conscience? They have need of strong armor that have God for their party. Number 4, was not death very terrible to you then? And is it turning back to your old courses a way to make it pleasant now? Is there any more sand in your glass now? It may be further from your mind, but sure it is nearer your heels than then. Secondly, to those with whom something remains so ready to die, this is a prevailing case of this generation, which is in a decaying, dying condition, in which there are several sad symptoms. First, the stomach for our spiritual food is gone. Ordinances are not prized, but despised. We look as we had got a surfeit of the gospel. Farms and merchandise go nearer the heart than occasions of communion with God. A sign we may come to fast till we find our stomach. Number 2, Zion's children have generally lost their color. Their beauty is gone. That heavenliness, that spirituality, tenderness, favor of godliness, sometimes about them is much away. And self-conceit, pride, formality, worldly mindedness, and untenderness has made them the color of the earth. Number 3, lastly, death is working powerfully amongst us by the most horrid ingratitude of the generation, for most signal repeated deliverances, under which the generation has nothing the bettered for it, and by the many melancholy divisions in which we are crumbled into many pieces, all forebodes our ruin. Stir up yourselves to strengthen what remains with you and is ready to die. Improve this ordinance, communicants, for strengthening the dying remains, and follow on with any little you have in order to recovery. First motive, the longer you be a beginning, it will be the harder to recover. Second motive, if you do not, you may come to lose more, yea, some may lose all that they have, the remaining spark will die out. And the last motive, you may and shall get a recovery if you ply the means. Hosea 6:3 says the prophet. Then shall we know if we follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as a rain, as a latter and former rain unto the earth. Objection. I meet with many disappointments. I think I will never recover. Answer. Consider the case of Job in Job 23 and the case of the spouse, Song of Solomon 3. Disappointments sharpen the appetite, teach honorable thoughts of sovereignty, and make the enjoyment sweeter when it comes. Objection. But I grow worse and worse. Answer. The darkest time of the night may be before the daybreak, Mark 9, verses 20 to 26.